Thanks very much for inviting me. It's a great honor and pleasure to speak to such a big and distinguished audience. And also, it's an honor and a little bit daunting to follow the last speaker in the series, unless I missed one, who was Pauline Cochet, who also just published a book on Razi. And to show that I'm not trying to unfairly compete, this is her book. And I really very strongly recommend it. So that this is an edition and French translation of one of Razi's extant works, which I will mention shortly in my presentation. And it also has a long, detailed introduction about Razi's thoughts, which is really crucial reading for anyone who's interested in Razi. So what I'm going to talk about is actually not primarily the doubts about Galen, although, as I say, I will mention it. I'm going to be talking about one issue that comes up there, but which we also know about through other sources, which is his views on place and time. And now you should be able to see my handout. And in particular, what I'm sort of driving towards, and we'll get to at the end of my talk, is how Razi accepts, contrary to what a lot of people would suppose, in my reading, he accepts Aristotle's physics and the principles of Aristotle's physics, but claims that these principles are only kind of superficial, or as he would say, relative to the true fundamental principles of physics, which he takes from Plato, albeit that he modifies the physical picture from what he takes Plato to have said. So that's kind of where I'm eventually going, but first I'm going to give you a quick introduction to Razi for those who weren't here for Pauline's talk, and to his theory of the five eternals. So his full name is Abu Bakr Muhammad ibn Zakaria Razi, and he is, here we already have a problem because he's not the only famous philosopher named Razi. In fact, you could argue that he's only the second most famous philosopher named Razi, because there's also Fakhruddin Razi, who lived in the 12th to the 13th centuries. And one question I always get when I'm giving talks on this Razi is whether I'm actually talking about Fakhruddin Razi. To add to the confusion, Fakhruddin is one of our most important sources of information about this Razi. And as if that weren't bad enough, one of our other most important sources of information about him is Abu Hatim Razi, an Ismaili thinker who reports on debates that they had with each other in person. That fact is actually kind of telling, in the sense that a lot of what we know about Razi's philosophy is known indirectly. In other words, he did write works about cosmology and the five eternal theory that I'm going to be focusing on in this talk, but these works are lost. And so we know about his views either because he glancingly refers to them in extant works, especially in Doubts About Galen, or because he is reported as having held these views by other authors, like Fakhruddin Razi and Abu Hatim Razi, but not only them. There's also another Ismaili author named Nasiri Khosrau, who talks about him at great length. And there are other authors like Al-Biruni, Ibn Hazm, and so on, who mention some of his views. Then there are thinkers who mention him only briefly to insult him, like Avicenna, Ibn Sina, in characteristically polite form, says that Abu Bakr Razi was even beyond his capacities when it came to inspecting feces and urine, never mind doing philosophy. Very nice. Maimonides also complains about Razi's theodicy. So his name is pretty well known, and he's often presented in a bad light by people who report his views. So part of what I'm trying to do in my book is reconstruct a plausible picture of his views and how they hang together, and draw on all of these sources while taking account of the fact that they're probably not very trustworthy in the way that they report him. That won't play a big role in my presentation now, but it does play a big role in what I have to say about Razi's views on prophecy. So if you want, we can talk about that afterwards. Uh, okay, so having said all that, even though it's true that his five eternal theory, which is the main focus of this presentation, was presented in works that are mostly lost, or entirely lost, actually. It's not that we don't have any works by Razi. To the contrary, we have a lot of writing by Razi. It's just that almost all of it is about medicine. So he wrote one of the biggest works in Arabic that I know of, which is called Al-Hawi, the compendium, or all-embracing work, which is a huge treatise, if you can even call it a treatise, in many volumes, like 24 volumes in the modern printing, which collects medical case notes from his own experience and notes of reading based on Galen and other doctors, also Arabic doctors who wrote in Arabic. We also have, for example, the book for Al-Mansur, which is a kind of encyclopedia of medicine, which is also a substantial work, though not nearly as large as Al-Hawi, and a lot of other medical writings, some of which are quite short. There's a medical introduction, which is a kind of nice sort of overview of Galenic medicine. There are short treatises on things like how to tell the difference between smallpox and measles, on diet, on why putting clothing on can keep you cool in certain situations. So really detailed things sometimes. Philosophically speaking, by far the most important work that people might classify as a philosophical, or sorry, as a medical work is the aforementioned Doubts about Galen that Pauline just edited and translated, because it touches on many issues in Galen that are not medical. For example, the eternity of the world, the nature of vision, the role of pleasure in the good life, atomism, and so on. So actually, that is an extant work that does tell us something about his physics. In addition to this, we have two philosophical works of his, which are, I guess, to be categorized in the field of ethics. And I think actually for English-speaking readers, it was Thérèse Zouart's studies in the 90s that, along with work by Len Goodman, really brought these to attention. So these are the philosophical life and the spiritual medicine. Very interesting treatises. The spiritual medicine is basically a work of ethical advice. And the fact that in the title it's called the spiritual medicine is to be taken very seriously. So the idea is that his book for Al-Mansur, this medical encyclopedia, is giving you advice on how to treat the body. The spiritual medicine is how to treat the soul. And ethical shortcomings of various kinds, and also bad habits and so on, are treated as being maladies or illnesses in the soul. That is another, I mean, even though we don't think of this as a kind of medicine anymore, Galen is an important source for Razi in a work like this, because he's drawing on texts like Galen's On Character Traits, Fil Akhlaq, which is actually lost in Greek but preserved in Arabic. Then there's also, in addition to the spiritual medicine, there's a shorter work called The Philosophical Life, in which Razi defends himself against some critics who say that he's a hypocrite because he claims to style his life, or his approach to life, his lifestyle, on Socrates. But everyone knows Socrates was a rigorous ascetic, whereas Razi is not a rigorous ascetic. And then he goes on to say, well, actually, Socrates was only a rigorous ascetic when he was young. He became more moderate when he was older and mature, and stopped being kind of over the top or extreme in his philosophy. And I follow the mature Socrates. Some people have, including Thérèse, have discussed whether there's a tension between these two works, because one seems to be much more ascetic than the other. So the thought is that the spiritual medicine really is encouraging you to avoid pleasures, and the philosophical life is saying, go ahead, just within measure and within moderation. So another thing I talk about in my book, as Thérèse has done, is how to reconcile these two treatises. In general, my whole approach to Razi, as I said before, revolves around, first of all, taking into account all of this evidence, but being pretty careful not to trust the later reports or even the contemporary reports, given how hostile they are towards Razi. Second of all, thinking more about the ancient sources of Razi's thought, and especially the role that Galen and Plato play in Razi's thought. And third of all, thinking about the way that he might be responding to contemporary kalam as a kind of arguing partner. So I think sometimes I say that Razi gives us a window into what philosophy in Arabic could have been like if it hadn't been so dominated by Aristotle. So we tend to think of philosophy in Arabic as, at least the narrow kind of philosophy responding to the Greek tradition, falsafa, as being sort of a combination of Neoplatonism and Aristotle. So we've got Kindi, Farabi, Messina, and Rushd, very Aristotelian. Razi, because he was a doctor, his primary reference points for doing philosophy are Galen, and because Galen was a Platonist, Plato. And so he's kind of in this alternate strand of the Greek tradition most of the time. And he's trying to develop a cosmology based on the fairly little that he knows about Plato's cosmology from the Timaeus. But he's also aware of Aristotle's physics, and he's not just ignoring it, as I'm going to try to argue. He tries to fit it within a broadly Platonist picture of the universe. That picture of the universe is, of course, set out in his infamous five eternal theory. And this is very complicated, and I won't be able to discuss all of it in detail, of course, but I wanted to read you this passage here because it's such a good overview of what Razi was committed to. So this is one of these other reports that tells us what he thought. Razi has taken from the ancient Greeks 5 principles of things, which include the creator, universal soul, primary matter, and absolute place and time. So that's 5 principles: God, the soul, matter, place, time. He built his own teaching on this and made this its foundation. He distinguished between time and duration on the basis that number applies to one but not the other, because that to which number attaches is finite. Just as the philosophers made time the duration of what has a beginning and an end, whereas eternity is the duration of what has neither beginning nor end. He said that with respect to this existence, the 5 eternals are necessarily existent. That in it which is sensible is matter, which has received form through composition. Matter is in place, so doubtlessly there is place. The variation in the states that come to matter is among the consequences of time, for some of these states come earlier and some later. Through time are known the old and the new, what is relatively older and newer, and what is simultaneous. So there can be no doubt about time. In existence are living beings, so there is doubtless soul. And among them, among the living things, there are intellectual things, and there is art of the highest perfection. So there's no doubt that there's a creator who is wise, knowing, perfect, benevolent, in the highest degree possible, emanating the power of intellect in order that there may be liberation. So that is basically all of Razi's metaphysics and cosmology in one paragraph. And so basically I wrote a whole book trying to unpack the content of this report in some ways and bring other reports to bear on it. Now I want to concentrate, as the title of my talk shows, on time and place, but let me just quickly give you an overview of why we need the other 3 principles: God, soul, and matter. The first thing we need to acknowledge here is that this is a very upsetting thing that he's saying, because if you're in the 9th or 10th century of Islam and you say, okay, I'm going to list the principles that are needed in order for the world to come into being. God, and now everyone assumes that you'll stop, right? Because Tawhid, the doctrine of Tawhid, says there's only one eternal principle, that's God. You shouldn't want any other principles. So there's a great burden of argument on him to explain why he's postulating these other 4 principles. So first of all, why do we need soul? He postulates soul because he needs it to solve the problem of theodicy. So very unusually, Razi does not think that this is like the best of all possible well, maybe it's the best of all possible worlds in a way. It's just that it's not very good. So it would be a better possible world would be if there had been no world at all, or if matter had never been organized as a world. Once the world exists and soul is connected to matter, it is exposed to a great deal of suffering and pain. And God, left to his own devices, would never have made this happen, thinks Razi. So since God wouldn't have like made the soul and put it into matter, thus exposing it to so much pain and suffering, being wise and benevolent, it must be that the soul decided to go into matter on its own, which already begins to suggest that you need soul to be somehow independent, like an independent second principle alongside God, because it's operating independently, and its foolish choice to involve itself with matter is an explanation of why the world exists at all. A completely speculative thought, but one which I tend to think must be right, is that one reason he's so interested in the problem of theodicy and suffering and so on is that he was a doctor. So he's spending all day, every day with sick and distressed people. And he's very struck, maybe more struck than most philosophers in the Middle Ages were, by how much suffering is undergone by humans. And he's trying to reconcile that fact with the benevolence and all-powerfulness and wisdom of God. Even with this idea, like the soul involves itself with matter, and that's where pain and suffering come from, you might wonder, well, if God is so wise and powerful, why does he allow the soul to get involved with matter at all? Like, why not prevent the soul from creating the world? And the answer is that God allows it as a learning experience. So Abu Hatim tells us that Razi compared this to a wise father allowing a boy to go into a garden full of insects and thorns. So basically, the father lets the son do this to teach it not to do things like that. There's another story about a wise father allowing his son to go to a dangerous country and sending a good advisor with the son. And what the son is supposed to learn is that it should come back home where it belongs. He should come back home where he belongs. So similarly, kind of paradoxically, the reason why God allows the soul to come into matter is to teach the soul not to do that. In other words, that the soul can learn through doing philosophy to liberate itself from matter and not seek or lust for this attachment to matter. God also does something additional, or two additional things to help. One is that he gives the soul reason. So as it says in this passage that I read out, if I can find it. It's right at the end. So he emanates the power of intellect, akl, reason or intellect, onto the soul in order to give the soul the ability to seek liberation. And actually that second metaphor that he gave with the father and the son, the wise counselor who goes together with the foolish son to the other country is supposed to stand for reason. So that's one thing God does. The other thing that God does is that he doesn't let soul make the world independently. Soul is independent in its choice to involve itself with matter, but God then steps in and designs the world to be as good as possible so that the soul's time there will not be a complete disaster. So in a way, this is Razi trying to have his cake and eat it too. He's able to allude to the good design of the universe as evidence that God exists and that God created the universe, but he's able to allude to the foolish soul to explain why the universe has so much evil in it. Okay, obviously this is a pretty breathtaking set of views he's presented us with here, and it would be well worth talking about this the whole time, but I'm just going to move on to the other three principles, which are matter, time, and place. So as far as matter goes, he's an atomist. This is another thing that differentiates him from kind of mainstream falasifa like Kindi, in Sina and so on. He does not think matter is continuous. He doesn't think bodies are infinitely divisible. He thinks if you keep dividing and dividing, you must get down to a smallest part. And this is something he argues for in Doubts About Galen extensively. I think that he is here partially inspired by Plato, who famously has this geometrical atomism where the four elements are put together out of shapes. So Razi similarly has elemental bodies being made by putting together atoms. Presumably it's God doing the putting together. But the atoms are not geometric. In fact, or it's not clear what they are. So it's hard to tell what shape, if any, the atoms are meant to have. The best evidence we get about that comes from passages like this. The difference between this is a report from Fakhreddin actually. The difference between the subtle and the dense arises simply because of the admixture of void. For to the extent that the parts from which the particular body are engendered are mixed together with parts of void, the body is subtle. When the parts from which a particular body is generated are mixed with parts of void, it will be a subtle body. If it's not mixed with parts of void, it will be a dense body. Whenever the admixture of void is great, the subtlety will be greater. Earth has no admixture of parts of void, so it is as dense as can be. Water has void, so it's more subtle. Air is even more subtle because it has more void, and so on. So one thing about this passage, which is easy to overlook, is that there's no void in Earth at all, which, if Razi thought about it, would tell him that the atoms that make up Earth have to fit together so that there's no space between them. So giving him credit for having thought about this, I reckon that the atoms are cubes. That would, of course, be exactly what Plato says in the Timaeus. I mean, because cubes fit together with no space, right? So if they were spheres, then they'd leave spaces in between. Notice also that he thinks the elements can turn into each other, and he thinks the difference between the elements is only in terms of how much void there is in them. So I reckon that the atoms that make up the other elements are also cubes, but just scattered in void space. But I'm guessing, because like I say, that assumes that he thought about the shape at all. We don't actually have any evidence that he had a fixed view on what shape the atoms are. In any case, the overall picture here is that we've got some atoms, there's an absolute matter, as he calls it, floating around in void space. Soul thinks, oh, matter, that looks good. Conceives a passion, he actually uses the word ishq for this, conceives a passion for involving itself with matter. The soul moves towards matter, and God thinks, ugh, silly soul, bad idea, but I'll let the soul do this in order to learn from the experience. Shapes a world for the soul to inhabit. Inevitably, this leads to a lot of suffering for the soul, but by the gift of reason, soul can remove itself from the matter which it has involved itself with and be liberated. Matter is in all of these things are eternal. So matter has always been there. God obviously has always been there, and the soul has always been there. Similarly, time and place are eternal. So here we need to be careful, because actually, as it says in our passage that I quoted before, he distinguishes between time and duration, zaman and mudda. So the idea here is that, just to anticipate, the idea is that zaman, time, is the temporal number or measure of a given event or motion. Duration is just eternal temporal extension. Okay? So for example, a day would be the measure or number of the sun's motion around the earth in this ancient cosmology. I know the sun doesn't really go around the earth. So that would be a good example of time. Duration is not dependent on the sun's motion or anything else. It's just going on constantly. Similarly, absolute place is going to be just extension or void, empty extension, independent of the matter or bodies that are in it. Something else, sorry to keep going back and forth, something else he says about time and place is that there's no doubt about time because it's the condition for things happening in temporal order, like some being older, some being newer. In other words, some things happening first and others happening later. And Razi seems to have had a really interesting view about this, which relates to Galen, which is that time is something that we know to exist immediately and without any argument. So again, this is a report from Fakhreddin Razi. Among those who affirm duration, Buddha, there are two groups. One holds that knowledge of its existence is knowledge that arises necessarily in us without any proof or demonstration. The other attempts to establish it through proof and demonstration. The first group includes Razi. Now, why would he say this? Well, part of it is that he offers sort of thought experiments. At least there's a thought experiment in Fakhreddin, which I take to go back to Razi, which suggests, let's imagine someone in a dark house who is like sitting calmly and is not even aware of their breath or heartbeat, and they're not aware of any motion around them. So they're just sitting there and there's nothing happening at all that they can detect, so to speak. And then according to the thought experiment, this person will still be aware of time passing, even without anything that time could be measuring. Parenthetically, I think that this argument, if it's true that it goes back to Razi, is an interesting anticipation of Avicenna's flying man argument, right? So you shut someone off from sensory awareness and they're still aware of something. In the case of the flying man, it would be that the flying man's aware of his own existence. And in fact, there may be a whole kind of genre of this kind of sensory deprivation argument before the flying man, which is a history someone needs to write still. In any case, we have this immediate awareness of time. And I think that this is inspired by Galen's work on demonstration, which Pauline was talking about earlier. So this is a lost work of Galen, which was full of criticisms of other philosophers who had given arguments on various topics that Galen considered to be non-demonstrative. So that, in other words, they fell short of the standard of complete and certain proof. And in one of the passages that we know about from this lost work on demonstration, in fact, it's mentioned by Razi among several ancient authors, Galen says that Aristotle's famous definition of time as the number of motion in respect of before and after is circular, because if you define time as the number of motion in respect of prior and posterior or before and after, then the only thing that prior and posterior can mean is temporally before and after, right? So you're defining time in terms of temporal concepts, and this is circular. And it looks like this is not clear because we're trying to piece together Galen's view on the basis of other reports, but it looks like Galen may have gone on to say that it's not possible to define time in terms of non-temporal concepts. So you can see that this might have been a kind of incitement for Razi to take this view that if we know about time, we must know about it directly. So it's not like we know that there's motion and then we number motion and get to the concept of time. So that would be Aristotle's view, right? It's when we see the sun moving around the earth, or we see people moving, or trees changing color, any kind of change like that. It's when we are aware of such changes that we can then number those changes or measure them, and that's time. He even says that without the soul measuring motions, there would be no time. Razi's view is exactly the opposite. He thinks that we immediately grasp time as a condition for the possibility of motion, as Kant might put it. So as I say here on the handout, that means that time is epistemically primitive, So in other words, we know it directly without any need for proof and without any need to get to time through something else. In particular, we don't need to get to it through motion. In addition, though, time is metaphysically primitive. So it's not just that time is known to us immediately and doesn't depend on our knowledge of anything else. It's also that time exists in itself independently, independent of any motion or any body. Again, this is a reverse of Aristotle's view. So Aristotle would say that time is the measure of motion. So obviously it's dependent on motion. In fact, it's dependent on us measuring motion. Razi, by contrast, would say that time is just there. And once it's there, motions can happen and they demarcate bits of time, like one day. So the sun going around the earth once sort of measures off a segment of what you could think of as an infinite line of time. So time is just running along like this, and then the sun's motion takes a chunk of it and demarcates it as a day. But in itself, time is not measured. It's not dependent on a motion of the sun or anything else. So as Razi says, if there were no heavenly sphere or it were at rest, this would not remove time in the true sense, which is duration and eternity. And as we already seen, time in itself is not numbered. There's an amazing passage in the debate that he had with Abu Hatim al-Razi, where Abu Hatim tells us that he asked Razi to explain what this absolute time or duration or eternity is. And Razi said, it is just this, tough, tough, tough. Now, what that means, your guess is as good as mine, basically. The translator of this work compared it to a heartbeat. I think of it as being maybe sort of like a metronome, like sort of tick, 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 like a clock ticking, except there's no clock and there's no heart beating. There's just time going on all the time, so to speak. Now, furthermore, so now we've got the idea that time is independent of motion and anything happening in time. Why is it eternal, though? Like, why can't God create time, which then would just go on forever, perhaps, or for a certain length of time, and then events could happen within this time that he's created? And his answer is that it is impossible for God to create anything except at a moment. So I think this is a very nice intuition. So his thought here is God cannot create time because when would he do it? Right? If there's no time yet, then there's no moment at which God could make time begin. And the moment in itself, as he says, is independent of anything that could happen in it. So whereas some people, like Ghazali, for example, might think that God creates the universe, and then as soon as the universe is there and motion begins, you have time, right? Because God would create the heavens, they would immediately start moving from the very first moment of the existence of the universe, and then time would be our measure of these motions. But Razi thinks that the time has to already be there in order for there to be a motion, or a change of any sort. And of course, creation is a change, so it can't happen without time. So that's what he thinks about time. What does he think about place? Well, for one thing, he has a similar argument to his argument about time, where he says that just as motion doesn't make time, so the things in time do not create time. They happen within time, which is already there. So bodies, which are in place, do not make place. Place is already there, and then you can put a body into it. So this is why God cannot create place. If God created place, for God to create place, he'd have to put it somewhere. So just as if there's no time, God cannot create time, because when would he do it? So he cannot create place because where would he put it? Intuitively. Now, important line for me is in one of the reports about this. Razi is said to have argued that time and place understood relatively are different from time and place in the absolute sense. Relative place is the place of the thing that is placed. And if there's nothing placed, there is no place. Also, the time that is determined by motion would disappear if what we're moving is what is moving were to disappear. By contrast, absolute place is place in which there may be body or not. Absolute time is duration that may be determined or not. So this gives us the idea that I mentioned before. Absolute time is just duration, and then a motion can demarcate part of that time as what we might call a relative time, right? So is the time relative to the sun is 1 day. Similarly, the place of a body, like a ball, for example, would be the place surrounding that body, but place in itself is just void. It's just empty space, which can be occupied by any body. Much as absolute time is a framework within which things can happen earlier or later, or before and after, so absolute place is a framework in which things can be far and near. And he says a really nice thing about this. I love this. They say it's possible for one thing to become far away or close. They say, by the way, is Razi. So Razi says it is possible for one thing to become far away or close to another, but the far never becomes the near, and the near never becomes the far. So what he means is, like, if I've got a ball, 2 balls, a red ball and a blue ball, I can move the red ball towards the blue ball, but I can't move the place of the red ball towards the place of the blue ball. The places just stay where they are. And different things can occupy them, right? I could replace, the word replace is good here. So I could take the red ball away and put the blue ball where it was, replacing the red ball with the blue ball, but the place is the same. And in itself, it's just empty. It's just void, which becomes full of bodies, which, as we know, are made of atoms. Of course, the place is only ever going to be completely full if we have Earth, because a pure Earth, there's no void at all. Something like a ball, which is not pure Earth, although it's probably quite earthy, would have at least some void in it. So you have this picture of atoms moving around in absolute space, which is eternal, infinite void. And when they occupy a section of that infinite void, that would be a relative place. It has no limit. So as I just said, it's infinite. And it's like a vessel for containing what is put in place. Abu Hatim says, as we'll see in a second, that Razi claimed to have derived a lot of this from Plato. And this makes sense in the case of absolute place, because Plato in the Timaeus talks about this so-called receptacle into which the divine craftsman places the universe. And so the idea that there's like some kind of universal receiver that takes everything would be what he means by absolute place. So it's like this infinite receptive principle, and elsewhere he calls it a passive principle, whereas God and the soul are active. Although there's actually some confusion in the sources about that. Sometimes it says that matter is the passive principle, but in any case, the point is that it receives bodies by acting like a vessel or container for bodies. Okay, so that's his view on time and place. Where does this all come from? And I'll be done pretty soon, in maybe another 10 minutes or so. Well, it looks like, if we assume that that this is based on Plato, that he's just saying Plato is right, Aristotle is wrong. So as I say, there's evidence in the debate he had with Abu Hatim, as reported by Abu Hatim, to this effect, because Abu Hatim says, well, I think that time is just the measure of motion. That's what I've learned to be the definition of time. And Razi says, sure, Aristotle believed what you say, but it's disputed. What Plato says about it is hardly any different from what I say. according to me, this is the best thing that has been said. And this is, for me, a very important line, because it shows that Razi considered his intellectual allegiance in his physics to be to Plato and not Aristotle. So what he's thinking here is that there's kind of two alternatives from antiquity. We've got the Platonic alternative, in which we have absolute, enduring, eternal, independent time and place, into which bodies can be put, bodies and motions. And on the other hand, we've got Aristotle, who makes time and place, as we might nowadays say, supervenient on bodies and motions. In other words, they're dependent or brought into existence by time, by motion and bodies. And at first glance, like also according to this passage, it looks like what Razi said to Abu Hatim is, well, you're an Aristotelian, I'm a Platonist. Now, before I complicate that a little bit and suggest that his attitude towards Aristotle may have been something other than just pure rejection, let me just dwell a little bit on why Razi might have thought he was following Plato here. Because actually, if you know the Timaeus, then you know that actually Plato says that time is generated when the craftsman starts the motions of the heavens. So actually, you might think that Plato's view is exactly what Razi is denying, namely that time depends on there being some kind of motion that demarcates time. So first of all, bear in mind that his access to the Timaeus may be not as good as ours. So, I mean, not only because he can't read it in Greek, but because he may be working with a paraphrase of the Timaeus by Galen, rather than, or in fact, he surely is working with a paraphrase of the Timaeus by Galen in Arabic translation, rather than with a translation of the whole dialogue. Actually, I haven't gotten my hands on it yet, but Amin Das has only just published a book about the reception of the Timaeus in Arabic and Galen's paraphrase of it. So that's going to be exciting to get our hands on. In any case, still, you might think, well, like whatever Razi thinks about the Timaeus, if he thinks that the Timaeus is committed to eternal time, he's wrong, because it says in the Timaeus that time is generated when the motion of the heavens begins. But remember that in the Timaeus, it also says that there is so-called disorderly motion before the cosmos begins. And how can there be motion if there's no time, right? So what Razi would say about this, I think, if we go all the way back to my beginning passage, remember, he distinguishes time from duration. So, or we could say he distinguishes between relative time and absolute time. Zaman idafi or binisba, and zaman mutlak. So the thought would be that before the universe exists, we have, he would say, atoms floating around in a disorderly fashion in void. And obviously there's already some kind of temporal extension. There's duration, but there's nothing to measure it. It's not numbered because there's nothing orderly or arranged happening. There's just random motion of atoms. And after the universe is created, through that story I told you about with the theodicy, the soul turning towards matter, God designing the world as best as he can. Once that happens, we have things like the sun's motion, which will, in an orderly fashion, demarcate predictable segments of duration, and that will be relative time. So that's why he could think that absolute time or duration, eternal duration, is something that the Timaeus is committed to. And as I said earlier, it's quite easy to see why he might think that absolute space or place would be based on the Timaeus, because it would just be the receptacle that receives bodies, the atomic bodies that the demiurge makes. Okay, so that's why there would be a solid reason for him to think that he's following Plato. What about Aristotle? Well, one thing that my whole discussion has shown is that although the fundamental principles of his physics are absolute place and absolute time and absolute matter, and he uses the word mutlak in all three cases, by the way, there's also relative time, relative place, and what I think he never calls relative matter or relative bodies, but which you could think of as relative matter, namely the elements, right? So just as you have eternal duration and eternal void or extension or place and eternal atoms, so you have demarcated times like days and hours. You have demarcated places like the place of one body, like again, the surroundings of one ball. And you have bodies like the ball, which are made of atoms. Now, what Aristotle does is he, in his physics, tells you about relative time, relative place, and bodies, the four elements, right? Or five, counting the celestial bodies. But there's something more fundamental than that. So as he says about relative place is related only to what is placed. If there's nothing placed, there's no relative place. So if you remove the body, then you remove the place, right? But of course, this is not true of absolute place. As we've said several times, empty void is just there. You can't get rid of the places, nor can you create them. The places are just there as locations which things can be occupied by. Sorry, which things can occupy. But relative place is clearly Aristotelian place. It's the place that's dependent on one body. Similarly, relative time is the demarcation or number or measure of a motion, just as Aristotle says, right? So Aristotle's definition of time is this, the number of motion in respect of before and after. So notice that again, going back to our favorite passage, he says that that to which number attaches is finite, right? So that's relative time. When you number a motion, you get Aristotelian time, i.e. relative time, which is fine. There is such a thing as relative time. There are days, and days do measure the motion of the sun around the earth. But more fundamentally, there's absolute time, which is just eternal duration. So in each case, in the case of time, place, and matter, we have a fundamental principle, which is Platonic, namely eternal duration, infinite void, and atoms. And then we've got relative time, the demarcation or number or measure of one motion. We've got relative place, the place of one body, and we've got elements and the things made of elements. So what he's done here is he's combined Plato and Aristotle in one physical theory. And although it's clear that he's, I think, drawing on the Timaeus, it's also clear that he's done a lot of work here himself intellectually, and he says as much. So when he's challenged about the sources that he's drawing on by he says, the ancients said various things about this, but through a lot of inquiry and contemplation of their principles, I have improved on this so as to arrive as what is irrefutably and inescapably true. And this, I want to suggest, is recognizably the voice of the man who wrote Doubts about Galen. So he's very respectful of Galen, he says, even though he's actually quite rude about him in Doubts about Galen, but he claims to be a great admirer of Galen. But he says, well, the problem is that sometimes Galen gives you arguments that are not certainly true. They don't prove what he wants to prove without any doubt. So I'm going to criticize him on that basis. I can improve on Galen, just like Galen improved on earlier doctors and was proud of doing so. Similarly, in my five eternal theory, what I've done is I've taken the ancients' physics, namely Plato and Aristotle, and I've woven them together in a better system so as to arrive at something that no one can refute. And that didn't stop Abu Hatim from trying, but I think it's a testament to how brilliant Razi's theory was, that even like looking at it through the filter of an unfriendly interpretation and presentation by Abu Hatim and other incomplete sources, we can put it back together and see that he's come up with this extremely innovative and creative physical theory that's nonetheless based recognizably on both Plato and Aristotle. Thank you very much.